Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is a pleasure to be here, and I think what I've been tasked to do is to really try to set a little bit of a context about climate change. And to try to do so in 12 minutes is almost as difficult as trying to deal with climate change itself. But I'm going to give it a chance. And really, all I want to ask you to do is, in the context of the particular sector which you represent, is to consider climate change. And so I want to do quickly a presentation that I've called Some Things for Consideration as we think about climate change and the Caribbean. And if you look on the presentation, you'll notice the four is in quotes, and it's deliberately so in quotes. Because really, to get you to begin to consider climate change, what I want to do is give you three sets of four things that I think you need to consider as I try to set a context of how we must think climate change as we begin to think about it in your particular sector. What am I talking about? The first thing I think when we begin to consider climate change that we want to think about is the four ways in which climate change is manifesting itself already in the Caribbean region or is going to manifest itself in the Caribbean region. I believe you could almost tell me what these four ways are, but there are four particular manifestations which I think are important for the water sector. First of all, you will agree with me that climate change is manifesting itself in the fact that we are a hotter region. And we're not talking about temperaments or those kind of things. But climate change is showing itself up in terms of us being a hotter region. The number of hot days we have right across the region has increased scientifically. The number of hot nights we have right across the region has increased scientifically. And the rate at which the nights have increased is greater than the rate at which the days have increased. And so when you put it all together, we have, in fact, more hot days and more hot nights in any given year in the Caribbean. Our summer starts earlier, it reaches its peak, and summer goes longer. So the first manifestation is that we are hotter, and that's important for the water sector. The second way climate change is already manifesting itself and will continue to manifest itself is that our rain has become way more variable, and the science proves it. What do I mean by this? If you look on how the long-term trend in rainfall is, we in fact haven't gotten wetter or haven't gotten drier. But what happens is that one year we are extremely wet, and then the next year we're extremely dry, or even within a year. So if you take, for example, this year, we began this year in many of our Caribbean countries extremely dry, but we're ending the year on a wet note. And it's the variability in the rainfall that has changed. Add to this that the character of how rain falls has also changed. So we tend to get many, many more consecutive dry days, and then when it rains, it really rains. That's the second manifestation you want to bear in mind. The third manifestation that you want to bear in mind is that we are seeing higher sea levels right across the Caribbean. And I think irrespective of where you are in the Caribbean, you could find a picture like the one that's on the screen. That one happens to be for Negril, and if you could see a green dotted line which is in the blue, it was where the beach in Negril was in 1971. Put that together, and really what I'm asking you to consider is that we are experiencing the emergence of a new climate era. And a new climate era that is marked by harsher conditions. The peculiarity of this emergence of this new era is that we will not see one versus the other. So it's not hotter or rain or variable rain or sea level rise. It's the multi-risk climate era. And that's the first thing that we have to consider when we can put climate change into context. So the first thing then, for key messages for consideration when we think climate change in Jamaica, is that there are four manifestations. Together, those four manifestations of things we are seeing already suggest the emergence of a new, harsher climate era, which is the multi-risk climate era. Well, if that is the first of the things we must consider, then the second four things that we must consider is therefore what I call the four challenges that climate change is posing. So if these are the way climate change are manifesting themselves, climate change is posing a certain set of challenges for the water sector, and in fact for all small islands. Very fortuitously, I'm sure everybody has followed the news over the last 2 days and seen that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN World Body on Science, has just produced their 1.5 report. And the 1.5 report makes some real telling things about climate change, particularly within the small island context. And it talks about the fact that climate change is already affecting people, ecosystems, and livelihoods across the globe. And it actually is a report for the Caribbean region because it talks about those who are disproportionately disadvantaged and what 1.5 in climate change will do. It's great context to tell you the 4 challenges that you have to consider that climate change is posing in this new climate era. What are these 4 challenges? Well, if we understand how climate change is going to continue to change, and it's the challenge of unrelenting climate. What am I saying? If you see that top diagram, it's a number of hot days that we have presently. That's the far left, things at the bottom, going to the number of hot days we're going to have by the end of the century. Easily by the end of the century, if we do nothing about climate change, 98% of the days in the Caribbean will be considered hot by current standards. Or if we take sea level rise, and even if we do something about sea level rise, by the end of the century, sea levels in the Caribbean will easily be up to 1 meter, potentially 2 meters higher than they are. The challenge that climate change is posing is the fact that climate change is not going to stop. And so it poses what I call the unrelenting climate challenge. And therefore it is something that is unavoidable to deal with. But climate change poses a second kind of challenge. It's not just a challenge of unrelenting climate. It's a challenge of what I call unfamiliar climate. I have just shown you that we're entering into a new climate era. And the thing that characterizes that era is unfamiliarity. So the truth is, climate in the Caribbean is behaving not in ways that we are used to. So we are not used to the consecutive hot days and nights and that it will characterize most of the year. Nor are we used to the extremely intense storm and having 3 Category 5s in the Caribbean at the same time. The new climate era will be marked by unfamiliarity. And that unfamiliarity poses a significant challenge for the water sector, but certainly for all the small islands of the Caribbean. It therefore is a challenge that we have to deal with. Climate change is posing another challenge. So it poses the challenge of unrelenting climate. It's not going to stop. And so we have to deal with that fact. It is putting an unfamiliar new climate regime, and we have to learn to deal with that unfamiliarity. But it's also posing what I call the challenge of the unprecedented climate. The truth is, if we do nothing about climate change, the kind of change we're looking at by the end of the century is significant change. We have only seen 1 degree of warming so far. By the end of the century, with nothing done, we are at 4 degrees of warming. We have seen variable rainfall in the Caribbean. By the end of the century, if nothing is done, it's variable rainfall, but 30% drier. We have seen more extremes. By the end of the century, it will be more intense extremes. And we have only seen 3.5 millimeters per year, but I've told you by the end of the century, we'll be 1 to 2 meters higher. You contrast what is to come with what we have already seen. It's now not just unfamiliar climate, it's climate as we have never seen it before. So it's unprecedented climate. And that's the challenge that also is being posed to small islands. And then the last challenge I would consider is what I call the unreliable climate. And that's the 4th challenge that climate change is putting down. The way to illustrate this is to use, if you remember that diagram I showed you with the multiple storms that have come in within 200 kilometers of Jamaica since 2000. Those are those storms, if you can read them on the screen. Hear the story of Jamaica. In 2001, we had Hurricane Michelle, and it cost us 0.8% of our GDP. Then in 2002, we had the May-June flood rains, and it cost us 0.7% of our GDP. We thought we got a break in 2003, so Charlie and Ivan made up for it in 2004. And Ivan cost us 8% of our GDP. Dennis and Emily, 1.2%, Wilma, 0.7%, Dean in 07, 3.4%, and the story goes on until we reach Hurricane Sandy, 0.9%. What I've not put there is the cost of drought on top of that. But can you begin to see that climate, which once could be considered a reliable partner in development, is instead becoming an unreliable partner in development because of its recurrent nature and because of the magnitude of the change? Every year we must spend on climate. Climate is posing a challenge of being an unreliable partner. The familiarity we are used to and we could depend on, rain at a certain time of year, and we could depend on that, is no longer there. It's no longer a reliable partner in development. What's the point that I'm trying to make? It's this. We must consider climate change, and here are some things for consideration. We certainly must consider the 4 ways it's manifesting itself and will continue to manifest itself, because those show us that there's a new, harsher climate era emerging. If you consider those things, then you have to consider the 4 challenges that new, harsher climate era is posing. It's a challenge of unrelenting climate, not going to stop. Unfamiliar climate, we have to deal with the variability. Unprecedented climate as we have never seen before. An unreliable climate that consistently derails development. Put it together, and what I'm saying is the challenge that climate change is posing is a challenge to learn to live in a new climate era. One more. We must consider climate change, and here are some things for consideration. Consider those 4 ways in which climate is manifesting itself. They're important for the water sector. Consider those 4 challenges that climate is putting down, throwing down to the Caribbean region. The challenge of living in a new climate era. And if I may just digress a little bit to say, the interesting challenge of living in a new climate era is trying to deal with the unfamiliar now while preparing for the unprecedented that is to come. How do you deal with the challenge of the near term versus the long term at the same time? But what would those 4 demands be? Simply, first, the demand for increased capacity. You cannot listen to what I have just said and not come to the realization that climate change is throwing down a demand in the water sector, that right now, in an already water-stressed region, there's going to be a demand for increased capacity. We are going into a hotter, drier environment, and increased capacity will be residential, commercial, industrial, you go right across the board. There's going to be a substantial increased demand for water from other sectors to support them, and so the water sector becomes pivotal to the development of other sectors, especially the energy sector, the health sector, the agriculture sector. It throws down the demand, therefore, for water capture, water storage, water extraction, but you are the experts in this area and you know that. If climate change is throwing on a demand for increased capacity, then it's clear that climate change is throwing on a demand for flexible capacity. In an era of uncertain and unpredictable climate, the challenge that the water sector has is a challenge to quickly respond in both time and space. So quickly respond when the climate changes in time, but also quickly respond to deliver in space where the deficits emerge. It's clearly throwing down a challenge to deliver flexible capacity. Climate change is throwing on a demand to not only deliver flexible capacity, but to deliver resilient capacity. Climate change is making a demand that within the sector you have to have resilient capacity. And I don't need to go into that because you can see it. It's challenging coastal infrastructure. Lots of our infrastructure is coastal, including those belonging to the sector. But it's also damaging the very infrastructure that supports the sector. And you can see that in any intense extreme event, it's throwing on a demand for resilient capacity. And lastly, it's throwing on a demand for innovative capacity. One of the only ways we're going to handle climate change in the small island context is through innovation. And certainly that innovation, in light of the other demands, the demands for sufficient capacity, for flexible capacity, for resilient capacity, is to deliver innovative capacity. We need water solutions that make maximum use of this new variable natural resource that clearly support reusing and recycling, that squeeze out greater efficiencies, that don't demand an energy source that only will contribute to the climate change, but therefore that deals with its own emissions, that are rooted, of course, in equitable delivery of the resource. Climate change is making a demand for innovative capacities. Well, that's your expertise. What am I saying? As a sector, you must consider climate change. There's no way you cannot consider climate change. When you begin to consider climate change, just consider what are the three sets of four considerations, the things for consideration. Consider that there are four manifestations, and those manifestations lead us to the idea that what climate change is doing is creating a new harsher climate era. You can't miss it, the multi-risk era. What climate change is doing is throwing down four challenges. Those challenges is how we learn to live in this new climate era, how to deal with the unfamiliar today, at the same time preparing for the unprecedented to come. And then climate change is simply making four demands of your sector: increased flexible, resilient, and innovative capacity, or put it together, capacity that can deliver in spite of the new climate era. If you put it all together, you can see why you must consider climate change. You have to consider climate change because it's the only way you can move from the emergence of a new climate era to capacity that delivers in spite of that climate era. My simple context setting is climate change is important. Please consider it. Thank you.